Okay, so we're going to break down a pretty intense White House briefing. It's all about two major fronts the administration is dealing with right now: what's happening at home with security and a really high-stakes military conflict overseas. Let's just jump right in and unpack what they said. So here's the plan. First, we're going to look at the administration's tough stance on immigration enforcement. Then, we'll pivot to their two-track strategy for dealing with Iran. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the military goals for something called Operation Epic Fury. And you're going to want to stick around for the last part. A pretty surprising answer to the question, who's actually footing the bill for all this? All right, so the briefing started right here at home, on the domestic front. It was pretty clear the administration wanted to hammer home one particular point about their immigration policy, to make sure there was absolutely no confusion. And that big point, it was all about consistency. The speaker basically said, look, you might have seen some leadership changes over at Homeland Security, but don't get it twisted. Our core policy is exactly the same. And that mission, as they put it, is all about deporting who they call the worst of the worst criminal offenders. And to really, drive that message home, they brought up a really tragic story, the case of Sheridan Gorman. She was a young college student in Chicago, just walking with her friends when she was shot and killed. The administration used this very specific, very emotional example to argue that their enforcement policy isn't about politics. For them, it's about necessity, a way to protect American lives. This is where they took a shot at the media. The speaker was clearly frustrated, and they came with receipts. They put up this data saying the major networks barely covered the story. I mean, look at this. They called out NBC for giving it just 23 seconds of airtime. Their point was that the media has a duty to report on these things, especially when there's this big political fight happening over funding for security. And that brings us to the funding debate itself. This is really key to understanding their position. They're basically saying that their political rivals are holding the Department of Homeland Security hostage. They claim that the other side has voted against funding 7 different times, and because of that, the president has to step in with temporary measures just to keep things like the TSA up and running. It's a pretty strong accusation. Okay, so let's shift gears now. The second half of this briefing was a total pivot. We're going from the streets of Chicago all the way to the super complex world of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Specifically, we're diving into the administration's two-pronged strategy for dealing with Iran. Yeah, this is your classic carrot and stick approach. On one side, you've got the carrot. The speaker confirmed they're having private talks with what they described as a new and more reasonable regime in Iran. So they're kind of testing the waters, seeing if this new group will stick to their word. But then there's the stick, a very public, very loud threat of serious military action if Iran doesn't follow through. And wow, just in case anyone thought they were bluffing about that military threat, the speaker dropped this pretty chilling line. They actually referenced past Iranian leaders who, in their words, lied to the United States and are no longer on planet Earth. I mean, you can't get much clearer than that. The message is simple. Don't test us. Our patience has a limit, and it's a final one. So that begs the question, right? What do these grave consequences actually look like in practice? Well, the briefing got right into it, laying out the details of the military campaign that's already underway, and it has a code name, Operation Epic Fury. And they were super specific about the goals. They laid out 5 clear objectives. So this isn't some vague, open-ended mission. It's a detailed plan to basically take apart Iran's ability to wage war. We're talking about their navy, their ballistic missiles, the factories making missiles and drones, and even their proxies in the region. And the ultimate endgame? To make absolutely sure Iran never, ever gets a nuclear weapon. They also put a clock on it. The Pentagon apparently estimates the whole thing will take about 4 to 6 weeks. And get this, the speaker said this briefing was happening on day 30 of the operation. So what that tells you is this isn't meant to be a forever war. It's designed as a quick, focused strike, and they're already deep into it. Okay, and that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. And honestly, this might have been the most surprising part of the whole briefing. After all this talk about military goals and timelines, a reporter stood up and asked a really simple, practical question about money, about the cost of it all. The question was blunt. Who's paying for this war? And the reporter was smart. They brought up a historical example, the 1991 Gulf War, back when countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait basically picked up most of the tab. So the question was, is something like that on the table again? And the answer was, well, shockingly direct. The speaker didn't dodge it. They basically confirmed that yes, getting Arab nations to help pay for this is definitely not off the table. In fact, they said it was something the president would be quite interested in. So that strongly suggests they're already thinking about, or maybe even planning to ask, their allies in the region to help cover the costs.
So let's just wrap this up. What we saw in this briefing was an administration fighting on two very different fronts. On the home front, you have this really hardline, unwavering policy on deportations, backed up by some very powerful emotional stories. And then on the world stage, you have this incredibly high-stakes game with Iran, a real mix of quiet diplomacy and very loud military force.
And it all kind of leaves you with this one big question, one that really gets to the heart of their entire foreign policy. When you're talking softly behind the scenes, but carrying a massive stick out in the open, which one is really speaking louder? Which one actually gets the results?